Good morning. Welcome to the Long Live Alternative Parties podcast. Free Press Media Press Inc., an alternative parties books publisher, sponsors this podcast. I'm Andrew Bouchard.
Welcome to the Long Live Alternative Parties podcast. Today, friends, we have another exciting guest like we always have in this podcast. We have a representative from the Term Limits Party. He's going to talk to us about his party and his vision and his belief in term limits. So, welcome to the podcast. Kindly introduce yourself to our audience. Give us a brief background sketch, an introduction to yourself, and first, let's start with your name.
I'm Max Abramson. I'm a third-term state representative from New Hampshire.
Okay, great. And kindly introduce us to yourself, a brief background sketch.
So, in a nutshell, you know how there are some legislators, politicians, they run because they have an agenda. I ran for legislature because we couldn't get candidates to run at the last minute. I didn't want the Democrats' agenda to become policy in New Hampshire. I know that they're also there's kind of GOP establishment. Some of you have had to deal with them. They also have their own agenda, and then there are also big business groups and whatnot. So it was kind of as a legislator, I'm kind of fighting both of them at the same time. But my whole purpose was to kind of combat political agendas. So I also did have my own ideas, which was I'm a big supporter of term limits and limited government. So we had this constitutional amendment proposed. My third term of office, I went in and I introduced a bill calling for an Article 5 convention of the states to send back an amendment to a proposed amendment to the Constitution to limit the terms of members of Congress and also limit their powers and budgets.
Okay, so that sounds good. So what is the Term Limits Party? Kindly describe what that is and your vision for it.
So the Term Limits Party right now on Facebook is just a group with a few hundred participants, and they're mostly term limits activists and friends and politicos, people who are politically interested, grassroots activists I've talked to. I didn't believe in third parties a long time ago because I knew about the uphill battles that were in place just for ballot access and first past the post. But over time, I did get involved in the third party movement. I've probably networked with every major third party there is, from the Green Party, the Libertarian Party, to the Reform Party, over the years to try to bring them all together into one kind of cohesive effort. That was kind of like just barking up an empty tree. But I I did find quite a few people who were interested in actually getting people elected, and almost all of them also supported term limits. 85% of Americans, according to polls, support term limits, and even 76% of Democratic voters support term limits on top of that. And people who are further left politically actually are more inclined to support term limits. They understand that we're not going to get anything done, whatever your particular policy proposal is, whether it's ending the war on drugs, downsizing government, protecting civil liberties, stopping the war on terror, bringing the troops home, whatever policy change that you want, whether it's campaign finance reform or putting an end to gerrymandering and a lot of the corruption in politics, none of that can be done as long as you have these 20, 30, 40, 50-year career politicians in our state legislatures and Congress running things. So this is kind of a first step that we all kind of have to agree first and foremost has to be done.
Okay.
And I don't think that any major changes are going to happen unless we have a way to kind of dislodge these entrenched career politicians.
So you see the term limits as a domino effect, that if you get term limits out of the way where people aren't in office for so many years, then you can take care of all these other issues, domino after domino.
Well, I'm realistic. So I know that, for example, the Greens, their big proposal is they want to get universal health care through Medicare for all. And while I don't agree with that, I have my own health savings account proposal that I think would be a better deal. I couldn't get my 007 tax cut plan in front of Congress, and it would certainly never get passed. And you couldn't get Medicare for all. You couldn't bring an end to this insane war on drugs, which has killed or contributed to the deaths of probably between 2 or 3 million Americans. Absolute disaster. And yet you've got these 80-year-olds in Congress, not that it's just about age, but you've got career politicians who've been in there since, before the Macintosh, before personal computers were common, before the World Wide Web. They know nothing about cybersecurity. They know nothing about the private sector. And if you want to bring about any change, if you want independent redistricting commissions, proportional representation, GMO labeling for consumer goods, whatever policy that you might want, even with term limits, it would be a long haul. It would be difficult work. But without term limits, every change is impossible.
Okay. So it's not a cure-all, but it can get us in the right direction.
Right.
Okay.
I mean, we literally have, GMO labeling has had support of, I think, 91% or 92% of the public. I introduced a civil rights bill to end racial profiling. 20 states still allow racial profiling. And to deal with over-sentencing and overcharging of people according to race. I introduced that bill. It had almost 100% public support. But the Democrats tabled and killed it because they didn't want a Republican getting a civil rights bill passed.
Oh.
So the only way to undo that is, I think, through term limits. That gets rid of some of the entrenched party leaders who control all the backbenchers.
So what would you say to somebody that would argue that we don't need term limits because we have a democracy, we can vote the people out?
I mean, you're welcome to vote against them, but 98% of incumbents in Congress get reelected, despite the fact that Congress has a 7% approval rating. There's a poll that was released a couple of years ago that said 60% of Americans would vote out every single member of Congress if they could, the whole lot of them. And it was a near majority at one point that wanted them all sent to jail.
Oh, wow.
Wanted them all indicted and prosecuted and everything because the amount of corruption. Maybe the savings and loan scandals before your time, but that wasn't just Democrats. There were Republicans in Congress who voted for the guarantee that led to that crisis. And it was a Republican president, Ronald Reagan, who signed the bill. Now, presidents are term limited. They're limited to 2 terms ever since Eisenhower. And that constitutional amendment was passed during Harry Truman's administration.
Wow.
Because FDR had been in there for 4 terms.
Yeah.
So, but Ronald Reagan was limited to 2 terms. Now things haven't really gotten better in the White House, with, more scandals and more corruption with, the Bush administration and Whitewater and travel office scandals and other nefarious things going on. And it's usually 20 to 30 years before the government admits that they lied to us about everything. But at a minimum, if you have someone like FDR who's in there for a long, long time, you can get some new blood in there. At least you get a chance to try to clean things up. In the case of Mitch McConnell's been in there for 35, almost 40 years. Nancy Pelosi's been in Congress for almost 40 years. Chuck Schumer's, one of the guys. So if you support Medicare for all, you can't even get a vote because in the Senate, both the establishment Republicans and establishment Republicans will not allow a vote. Or you may hate that idea so much that you want to vote out any politician who supports Medicare for all, but you still don't get a vote on the floor. I'd like to at least see a vote on the floor, just so we can see what side people are on issues like that. The unconstitutional Dark Act violates the 10th Amendment. We can't get GMO labeling at the state level anymore. And it was entrenched politicians from both parties, including Senator Ayotte from New Hampshire, who voted for that, and it was signed into law by none other than Barack Obama. So you had politicians who've been in there forever The tendency is that your junior and sophomore members of Congress have to be responsive to the public, because if they want to serve in Congress for any length of time and get anything accomplished, they have to get reelected, which means they have to respond to the voters. But by the time they get to about 20 years, they have such free name recognition, free news media coverage, ranking privileges, basically taxpayer-funded campaigning where they can send out little, soft letters to constituents and mass mail everyone. The incumbents have so many different advantages, fundraising advantages. They can extort money out of lobbyists and get all kinds of different little goodies, free benefits. They can spend their entire time in Congress using their campaign office and using their campaign staffers to help them set up political events and state town hall meetings where they just, say all kinds of nice things about themselves, and then they leave. And you literally have members of Congress who don't even live in their district. They live in Washington, D.C., or they have a house outside of their district, and they keep getting reelected every year. It's impossible to remove them.
So given you mentioned how we have term limits for the president, why do you think we've accepted it for the presidency but not for Congress?
So the American people do support term limits for Congress.
Okay,
but
I'm sorry, why haven't we implemented it? If we agreed to implement it for presidency, why haven't we implemented it for Congress?
Because Congress is the body that submits proposed constitutional amendments.
Okay.
And every time they decide whether or not they want to get fired or not, they decide to just throw it in the round bin and not even bring it up for a vote.
Okay.
So that's the terrible thing. And even though there are 41,000 zip codes in America, all 41,000, every single one, the public overwhelmingly supports it. Supports term limits, black, white, young, old, rich, poor, gay, straight, every single demographic, every single way they divide it up, men, women, retirees, young kids, every voting group from, basically 0 to 100, all support term limits, and there's not a single group outside of Congress. Now, there is one other way under Article 5 of the Constitution, and that is to have state legislatures propose it. And once 2/3 or 34 state legislatures propose it, Congress has no choice. They have to order a convention of the states to come in and put a draft model together and then send that back to the state legislatures for 38 states to ratify it. And we're only a couple of states away now.
Wow.
Just in the last 2 weeks, North Carolina House, Tennessee House, and Oklahoma House of Representatives all approved House resolutions. Those 3 states that'll go on to the state Senate. Unfortunately, in New Hampshire, we had about 1/4 of Republicans vote with the Democrats to kill term limits in the New Hampshire House. So it's not just a one-party problem. But again, it's just pure mathematics, and just getting to the point where we can get majority of House and Senate to support term limits means that you've got to have some kind of term limits party that targets just Democrat seats for the general election, and then also targets entrenched Republicans in Republican primaries.
Sure. So given that our founders warned against this type of thing, they were very concerned about concentration of power. That's the whole start of our country. We didn't like the history of monarchies, and we wanted to do something different. How do you think this happened despite all their efforts to prevent something like the concentration of power?
So the original Constitution, which theoretically we live under today, very specifically enumerates the powers of Congress under Article 1, Section 8. And there are only 18 clauses total. And then scattered around there are a few other really minor powers, dealing with various declarations and appointments. But the basic powers of Congress are things like the post office, protecting our seaports and borders, Army and Navy, coining a uniform currency, standards of weights and measures. So the federal government is so limited. It's about as limited as maybe if you put the European Union and NATO together in one organization. That's about all the federal government was supposed to do. And in Europe, I think that they're being, they're very cautious of the idea of merging the EU with NATO. So they keep those institutions completely separate. And they maintain absolute, a short leash on them. What we used to have before the 17th Amendment was the state legislatures also kept their senators on a short leash. So we had indirect elections of senators. So if you ran for state legislature, voters would tell you what kind of person they wanted for U.S. Senate. And you could tell right away if a voter only cared about that one issue, because they would name a specific Senate candidate. And so some legislators didn't like that, just running on a platform of supporting some candidate they didn't like or didn't agree with, but they would hear from their constituents that they wanted that particular individual. So it was ironically the legislatures who asked Congress to pass the 17th Amendment and send this directly to the voters. Unfortunately, as a few people warning the public mentioned ahead of time and warned legislators ahead of time that gubernatorial races and congressional races already were driven a lot by campaign finance money. And the result of the passage of the 17th Amendment was we lost indirect election of senators who were no longer had to answer to what state legislatures' concerns were. And as soon as that passed, the federal government grew, very, very quickly, started creating lots of unconstitutional agencies and federal laws that interfered in state power. And so state legislatures became reduced to nothing more than administrative provinces. And so you literally just have one big top-heavy federal government interfering in housing, healthcare, schools, electricity, driving up the cost of everything that we buy, but also becoming a source of cronyism and blocking competition in the marketplace and causing all sorts of economic and political mayhem. So the 17th Amendment, which went through the other route where Congress proposes a constitutional amendment and then the state legislatures ratify it. The other approach is for 34 state legislatures to propose something, and then it comes back to be ratified either by 38 state legislatures or by the voters in 38 states. So the process can start either way. Either Congress sends it down or the state legislatures send it up.
I see. So you think we have reason for optimism, given all of the public support for it?
I do, because with hundreds of thousands of activists and voters around the country who are interested and care about this issue and want to do something, there is a way working through our state legislatures that we can get the Constitution amended to bring about term limits.
Okay.
And it's a long, difficult, laborious process. Amending the Constitution is supposed to be a long, laborious process to make absolutely sure that we're absolutely sure that this is an amendment that we want brought about, that we want the Constitution changed in some way, and in particular if it's a structural way. So we have the structure, then we have the Bill of Rights, and then thirdly we have the powers of Congress. The powers of Congress are being completely ignored. So there's a provision in this proposed constitutional amendment to limit the terms, budgets, and powers of Congress.
Okay.
And the amendment, if it gets ratified, would limit federal spending, and it would limit the federal regulation and federal powers to just what's in the Constitution, just the regulatory powers. That third provision is kind of limited, and it's meant to not give the courts a whole lot of leeway. We don't want to just transfer power from Congress to the courts. So the two important ones are limiting the terms of Congress, and then second, limiting the budgets of Congress.
Okay.
And hopefully get the federal budget deficit down and maybe even balance the budget.
Sure.
So
Max,
I'm
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah.
I cut you off.
So there's a debate, a scholarly debate underway. It seems that either 32 or 33 states have already approved a request for a constitutional amendment for a balanced budget amendment.
Okay.
And that balanced budget amendment, most of the states specify how the wording occurs, but because some states don't specify the wording, it's not clear what commissions each delegate will get. Now, there have been over 200 state constitutional conventions in our history, and there have been almost 200 state constitutional conventions. Over 200. Sorry, I'm wrong. I was right the first time. There have been over 200 state constitutional conventions. There have been almost 200 state constitutional conventions, federal constitutional conventions. My bad. My memory's going as I get older. But altogether, about 400 in total. Altogether, there have been over 10,000 delegates sent by state legislatures to these various conventions. We're being told that if there were a convention of states, they could come up with anything, they could propose anything, they could do anything. And that's the scare tactic that's being used to scare people away. And the reality is that out of these 10,000 plus delegates, not a single one has ever exceeded their legislative commission ever. Over 10,000, over 200 years, it's never happened. Even at the Philadelphia Constitutional Convention, that wasn't even a convention of the states. That was bigger. It was a constitutional convention. And some delegates had to go back to their state legislatures to get an enhanced commission so they could consider the subject material. The other thing is, it still has to be ratified by 38 states. And even if Congress bypassed the state legislatures to try to get something else, Congress could theoretically do that right now. They don't need an Article 5 convention of the states. Congress could say, well, we want to bypass the legislatures, and Congress can propose, hypothetical Death Star amendment or death stamps or who knows what, giving themselves pay raises and absolute power. And then they could bypass the legislatures and get the voters to pass it. If there's really some terrible language that the voters aren't going to read. And they could send that down, presumably, and set really tight timing deadlines and whatnot, have everyone vote on it. But the process has been working for 200 plus years. The only realistic way to bypass Congress was created right at the very end of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1789, I think it was. And someone spoke up right before they were about to adjourn, and someone said to James Madison, what if the problem with the new federal government is from Congress itself? What if Congress gets out of control? What if Congress becomes a problem? What if we lose our representative democracy because of what Congress is doing? How will we get around that? And so with his pen, James Madison wrote a comma in Article 5 and added this second sentence, this possibility of a convention of the states, this one other means. So if the government really got out of control, if government really went too far, that we could, through this process, enact a constitutional amendment, even if Congress opposed it. And it was said multiple times in convention, it was said in early Congresses, it's been said by the U.S. Supreme Court, that Congress has no way of stopping an Article 5 convention, that it's entirely up to the state legislatures and to the voters. So the state legislatures would submit it, and if we can't get 38 state legislatures to ratify it, we could get the voters in 38 states to ratify it. All 50 states, the voters support term limits. There's overwhelming support there. So there's absolutely no reason on earth excuse me. There's absolutely no reason on earth why we couldn't do this. Now, to do this through a political party, the only way to accomplish that, to get enough legislators elected, get enough members of Congress, at least a few members of Congress elected, to get 2/3 majorities where they're needed, the only way to pull this off is with the term limits party that only targets entrenched Democrat districts in the general election and targets Republican districts in the primary. So it's kind of a 50-50. That strategy I've got listed and outlined on the social media pages, and I'll post more links. Because we have first past the post, we have to use this tactical voting strategy. Canada, Britain, and all of these other first past the post countries and all these other plurality districts, de Verger's law means that you only get 2 political parties that rise to the top in any particular district. So the only way to get districts, the only way to get how do you say it? The only way to get people elected is to target those 1/3 of districts in the country out of about 500,000 races, and I think it's 100,000+ partisan races. There are 7,400 legislative races. About 2,000 of those never go Republican anyway. So right now, there's no way to get a term limits vote out of those districts. But there is a way with a third party only going after those 2,000 legislative districts and 170 U.S. House districts in Congress that never elect a Republican, having a term limits party that's more of a big tent party, that's more open, and then we can replace a few, Nancy Pelosi's and Chuck Schumer's and Maxine Waters. You replace candidates like that with term limits candidates, and then the term limits candidates are able to get term limits enacted.
Okay. That sounds good. So how can our audience support your efforts?
So we're organizing in 2 different ways. If you want the nonpartisan way, which is no relation to the term limits party, the nonpartisan way is through U.S. term limits. They've got website, organization. They have, I think, something like 100,000+ activists around the country. There were like 8,000 or 9,000 just in New Hampshire alone. It's one of the largest, if not the largest group of activists in New Hampshire, which is normally a fairly active state. The other way is to go onto the Facebook group right now and just join Term Limits Party.
Okay.
It's the one with about 600 members on it, and I'll post the link for this podcast so you'll know that that's the correct one.
Okay,
there was an American Term Limits Party, but I don't think that they ran any candidates and weren't very active.
Okay.
And this, sorry again. This strategy of just targeting it, only entrenched Democrat districts, sounds like it's a long shot, but actually it kind of, if you're running for legislature, it gives you the 80-20 issue right there, that you're going to the voters and you can say, well, look at this race, I'm running on the term limits party because my Democrat opponent has been voting against term limits. If you support term limits, please support my campaign. I think that for a kind of a more of a politically centrist political party, I think that we can pull a coalition together and actually get people elected to legislature, get people elected maybe even to Congress, and have working majorities in 38 states where we can, dislodge some entrenched Republicans in their primaries by supporting term limits candidates there, and then turn around and take the same organization of activists and donors and sign waivers and so forth and have them show up in the November election and replace Democrats who oppose term limits with term limits candidates.
All right. Sounds like a plan.
Mm-hmm.
We can post those links for our audience? and if they're interested, they can go there.
And we'll have, I think there's already a link up for the U.S. term limits. Again, the two organizations are totally separate. We support the term limits movement through partisan elections. U.S. term limits supports it through nonpartisan activism. They're a nonpartisan organization. Obviously, the Term Limits Party is a partisan organization. But we'll have to set up events.
Like I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, best way to do it is to set up either monthly events in your own state where you can meet with other people who support term limits, have people show up. What we've done in New Hampshire in the Liberty Movement is to just have like a local pizza shop that allows groups to come in, and then you'll have, some months you'll have 6 or 8 or 10 people show up, and other months you'll have 20 or 30 people show up, and then people give kind of their news and updates for what they're doing, what bills have passed, what bills they plan to introduce in the next session to try to get something done, who's running for office and why. And the most important thing, I think, is having a clear set of goals, guidelines, have a clear platform for the Term Limits Party, which is something that we can do nationally. And then whether members want to set up just one big Zoom meeting or want to set up a big national convention or conference, I'll leave that up to them. And then hopefully we can cross-pollinate with other groups and form a coalition that gets people elected to state legislature.
Sure. That sounds good. Max, we thank you for coming on the podcast today and talking about your efforts to enact term limits.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
All right, sure thing. Take care, all the best, and we wish you well in whatever you do.
All right, yeah, have a great one.
Bye now.